Good afternoon. I am so grateful to the Lord for another beautiful day. It is a real joy to think about reopening on the 28th, and I'm so thankful to God for how many of you have already replied to our survey, letting us know how you will be connecting with us, if it's immediately when we reopen, or if it's in a couple weeks, or if you're unsure. If you have not yet responded to our brief survey, there's just a couple questions on in the email, the e-bulletin that was sent out on Friday. It will literally take 15, 20 seconds at the most. And we'd like to know if you're going to be able to rejoin us on June 28th for worship. So if you take that time, fill out that survey, that will really help us. We don't want to discourage anyone who is desiring to come. We want to protect those who are immunocompromised, and we want to do it well. And so we've even had a quick staff meeting today that we're planning for what the next couple weeks are going to look like. So I'm really excited about that. I wanted to take a look today at Book 4 of the Psalms. And Book 4 begins at Psalm 90 and it goes to Psalm 106. It's just a short 17 Psalms. And in this book, there is a real shift that takes place in the book of Psalms. And I want to think today about how do we orient our perspective when the world has gone mad. Now, 2020, it's been a dumpster fire of a year in so many ways. We've had a global pandemic. We've seen American cities burning. We've seen racial protests and the difficulties of police brutality. We're experiencing an economic downturn unlike anything that any of us have experienced in our lifetime. This has been an unbelievable year. Nobody could have imagined what 2020 was going to be like. And yet here we are. We're in June. We're surviving. We're making it through. But what kind of perspective do we need to have? Because in the midst of a world that's going mad, what do you hold on to? What do you think about? How do you think rightly? The end of book 3, Psalms 73 to 89, it was a dark section. Psalm 88, we talked about that last week, one of the darkest Psalms. It is the darkest Psalm. No hope. It's the darkest Psalm of all of them. And Psalm 89 ends with a whole bunch of questions. Have you cast off and rejected your people? The psalmist asks. Ethan, the Ezrahite, he asks in Psalm 89, verse 38. But now have you cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. And he goes on and on. You have defiled David's crown, essentially, in the dust. You've breached all of Jerusalem's walls. You've laid his strongholds in ruins. All who pass by plunder him. You've exalted the right hand of his foes. You've made all his enemies rejoice. You've turned back the edge of his sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? And so here is this question. In the midst of this perspective, let's set it. It's a dark time at the end of book 3. Israel being taken off out of their promised land into the land of exile. The temple lies in ruins. Jerusalem, its walls have been breached. People plunder her as they walk by. And the crown of David has been thrown to the ground. The crown has been cast to the dust. And the psalmist asks, Lord, where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David? What about this promise you made to David? Are you a God who makes a promise and then can't keep your word? Do you say at the altar, I do, and then when things get hard, you abandon your bride? Here's the question. And now, beginning in book 4, there is a radical shift of perspective. The temple destroyed, Jerusalem destroyed, the people moved out from their holy promised land. Now, it sounds a lot like 2020, the world has been turned upside down. Jobs have been lost, some forever gone in this economy. Churches closed. We've had violent protests. We've seen all sorts of incredible difficulty in 2020. How on earth are we going to get perspective? Well, look at how Book 3 begins. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Now, there's a whole lot here that I can't even begin to unpack today in our short 20-minute video, but there is a lot of connections here in Psalm 90 with Deuteronomy, I believe it's 32. We don't have time to look at it, but there's a connection here. The only times where Moses is called a man of God is here and one other place in the Old Testament. And notice how the perspective has shifted. No temple, Jerusalem's walls breached. There's no ability to offer sacrifices. There's no king, no temple, no priest, no sacrifice. And how does the perspective shift? It returns to Moses. Moses, the man of God, who had led his people out of the wilderness, the one who had been the leader to take them from Egypt and to the edge of the promised land. And now there's almost like this return. We're going to look at this from a perspective of old, the psalmist is suggesting to us. We're going to look back to Moses. And the perspective that we need in our day, today in 2020, is the perspective that Israel needed when they were taken off into exile and they had no temple. Verse 1 of Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. The temple was the place of God's presence. The tabernacle was the place where Israel would draw near to the Lord. When the tabernacle and the temple was gone, where is the dwelling place of God? And in going back to Moses, in remembering the time when Israel was wandering in the wilderness, the Psalms are structured here at the beginning of Book 4. Let's look back. Let's look back at who is our King, who is our dwelling place. It's not a temple. It's not a building. It's not a crown on the head of an earthly man. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. And this is why then Psalm 91 can start off with, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Here is the picture of the one who can trust themselves to God who brings blessing. Psalm 90 talks about this blessing. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And it goes on to say, satisfy us in the morning with your covenant steadfast love. If we wondered if, God, you could keep your promises, we look back to Moses. We look back to the days when you brought your people out of Egypt and then you brought them into the promised land. And if we're in exile, we're trusting that you'll take us out of exile and that you'll bring us again into your presence because, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. And there's this promise then of blessing, Psalm 91, of a long life. With long life I will satisfy him and I'll show him my salvation. We are coming out of our COVIDian exile. Now, that's not to say that coming out of exile is going to look like it was when we went into exile, but it's to say we're coming out of our COVIDian exile. And God has been our dwelling place and our refuge. He has been the one to whom we've had to go to over and over and over so that we would find strength and help and comfort and encouragement in this really long, hard, difficult season. And so here, as Israel looks at how are they going to survive in the midst of exile, the perspective has shifted. It's not about a building. It's not about a tabernacle or a temple. It's about the Lord being their dwelling place. And God has been our dwelling place. Now, in the midst of that, that God has been their dwelling place. Psalm 92 through 100 really covers these 9 Psalms. They cover the picture that the Lord is king. And we hear this refrain over and over. Psalm 93, verse 1. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on the strength as his belt. Or we hear in Psalm 96, verse 10. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. Or Psalm 97, verse 9. But for you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted above all the gods. There's this language of God reigning. Psalm 97, verse 1, the Lord reigns. Psalm 99, verse 1, the Lord reigns. And God reigns. And this picture that God reigns, he is the one who is the universal God. He rules and reigns over all. And that's good news in the midst of a COVIDian exile, in the midst of racial tensions, in the abuse of authority by some in the police forces, by chaos all around us, in the midst of economic turmoil, that we remember that the Lord reigns. It may not look like it, just like Israel was having to remind themselves in the midst of going into exile that they didn't need the temple for the presence of God to be near. What they needed was the Lord to be their dwelling place throughout all generations. And Psalm 96, in the middle of these Psalms of the Lord being king, we hear in Psalm 96, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. For great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods." Psalm 96 then functions in the middle of these kingly God rules, the Lord rules Psalms, Psalm 92 through 100. It functions as this hub. And there is this statement again, the Lord reigns. The Lord reigns, and we hear this refrain over and over in book 4 that he is over all the gods. Psalm 95, verse 3. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. Psalm 96, verse 10. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. He'll judge the peoples with equity. And we hear verse 4 is what I meant to read. The Lord, great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. Or Psalm 97, verse 9. For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. He is the ruler and the one who reigns over all. He's the king. This is good news. It's good news. And we want to remember that as we come out of our COVIDian exile, that the Lord has been reigning this whole time. That though the nations rage, Psalm 2, and the peoples plot in vain, the Lord sits in heaven and he laughs. And yet, in Psalm 100, at the end of these Psalms of the Lord reigning, we come back to this Psalm of giving thanks. And it talks about, in verse 4, Psalm 100, verse 4, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and bless his name. Now, here is how the perspective has shifted. We can look back to the temple and we can see that we could go into God's presence. But if Psalm 90, verse 1 is true, which it is, that the Lord has been our dwelling place throughout all generations, even before the temple was established, even before it was made a dwelling place for God to dwell among his people. The Lord has been the dwelling place of his people throughout all generations. But what about his promises? So he made promises that David, one of his descendants, would sit on the throne forever, 2 Samuel 7. What about this promise? What about the throne of David being cast to the dust? What about the crown being in the dust? Psalm 89, as we saw, verse 49. What about the promise to David? Psalm 101, 102, and 103, they reaffirm the promises that God has made to David. Notice at the end of Psalm 72, it had talked about how the Psalms of David have come to an end. But now we find Psalm 101, and what is the inscription to it? A Psalm of David. Or we look at Psalm 103, a Psalm of David. And here we come back to some Psalms of David. And what we hear in them are these reaffirmations of God's promise that he would rule. He would have David and his descendants rule forever. And yet, as David begins in Psalm 101, as he looks out, the psalmist puts these in a particular order here in book 3. And he puts them in a particular order and talking about how the king's house, we see this in Psalm 101, the king's house is a house of integrity. David says in Psalm 101, verse 3, I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. Verse 4, a perverse heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. Verse 6, I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. And so here's David's house. What is David's house going to look like? It is going to look like a house of integrity. In Psalm 102, what we hear is that David's house, David's throne, and God's house, and God's throne begin to merge. In fact, we hear that in verses 13, 16, and 19 of Psalm 102, where you will arise and have pity on Zion. Verse 16, for the Lord builds up Zion. Verse 19, he looked down from his holy height. From heaven the Lord looked at the earth. Here is this picture of David's throne and God's throne. The throne that had been cast to the dust, David's throne, now being reemerged. It's reemerging and it's coming together. Oh, I might have lost you. All right, we got interrupted there. My apologies. Uh, David's throne and God's throne are merging together. And as they merge together, we hear this promise at the end of Psalm 102. We lose it in English, but in Hebrew it's quite clear. Psalm 102, verse 28, the sons of your servants shall dwell secure. Their seed shall be established before you. There's the promise to David. I am going to secure the throne forever. And how will God do that? Psalm 103. It's a psalm of forgiveness, that as far as the east is from the west, so far has the Lord removed our transgressions from us. The Lord is faithful to his promise, and he will keep his word. His steadfast love is certain. Recently, my dad was telling me that before my grandfather passed away, he had gone to see my grandfather. And as they were visiting, my grandfather was my dad began to quote Psalm 103, and immediately it was rolling off of my grandfather's tongue. And I mentioned this to Melanie, and she began to quote Psalm 103. She had memorized it. This psalm, Psalm 103, has been such a comfort because it reorients our perspective when the whole world is a mess. We can wonder, where is God, and has he forgotten me? And yet our perspective is reoriented when we know that the Lord forgives, and that he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. The Lord has been our dwelling place throughout all generations, which is why then Book 4 ends with 3 psalms of praise. At the end of Psalm 104, 105, and 106, it concludes with the words, Praise the Lord. These have been challenging and difficult days, the days of all of the upheaval in the earth, all around us. Who would have imagined that nations could totter and shift? And yet, the Lord reigns. He has been our dwelling place. We're going to come out of this COVIDian exile, and we're going to do so longing to return to normal. And yet, here is our opportunity for us to confess, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. Is gathering together collectively as the people of God essential? I would say yes, it is. And our exile has taught us that while we have been apart, we really do need one another. That man was not made for bread alone, but he was made by, he survives, he lives on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Friends, we want our perspective to be reoriented. And our perspective has been reoriented in these days of Covidian exile. And now, let's not go back to normal, wanting life to return to what it was, when there were things that needed to be shaved away and trimmed off, and that our exile, just like Israel's exile, has brought us back to the most important thing, that we need the Lord, and that He has been our dwelling place, always and forever. I hope that you're encouraged, and that when you are able to return, that you can do so with the confidence that God has been our dwelling place, and that you would know that as we gather together, that the Lord loves to dwell and rule from the praises of his people, and that he loves to show his glory and his name as his people gather. So June 28th, I'm really hoping that if you are healthy and well, not immunocompromised, that there's low risk, that we'll see you very soon after our reopening. And I trust that as we worship together, that you will be strengthened in heart and soul. I am so thankful for so many of you who, through these days, have either sent a note of encouragement through email or text or a phone call. And I haven't been able to connect with everyone. I really wish that I would have been able to. But I know through what I have heard that God has been at work. So until I can see your beautiful eyes shining, until we can see each other face to face, know that our perspective has been shifted. God has been gracious to do that, and it's been good. That's all for Table Talk for Wednesday. I'll be back on Friday with Pastor Gary as we are on our Table Talk panel, and I'll look forward to seeing you there. Pray for us as we prepare to reopen, as we're quite excited to have the church reopened for public ministry on June 28th. If you haven't filled out that survey, go back to Friday's e-bulletin, and you can do that there. It'll take you about 30 seconds, and it'll help us. God bless you. Have a great day.